So we are doing 3 talks over 3 weeks, thinking about the city of Jerusalem. We've thought about Jerusalem in the past, and that brought us from the sort of the beginnings of Jerusalem, right at the very beginning of the Bible, and that brought us through to 1967. And so for the purposes of this evening, the present is from 1967, which is 15 years before I was born, like everybody to know that, through to today, as close as today as we can bring it. And what we're going to do is go through sort of the history of not just the city of Jerusalem, but the state of the nation of Israel from that period in 1967, from that date through to our present day. And we are going to try and think a little bit about what has happened with Jerusalem, try and see the way in which that fits into what God says was going to happen with Jerusalem, and bring us to the point at the end of the talk where we are then ready to see what is going to happen to Jerusalem in the future, and that, God willing, is going to be next week's talk. We read Psalm 48. If you've got your Bibles open, you've still got your Bibles open to Psalm 48. It is obvious to see from what we read in Psalm 48 that the city of Jerusalem forms a central place in the purpose of God. We thought about the purpose of God last week. We saw the way that God is preparing the world to set up his kingdom on the earth, that he will send his son, Jesus Christ, who is currently in heaven. He will send him to the earth, and he will set up the kingdom of God. And that the center of that kingdom is going to be the city of Jerusalem. That was all thought about last week and will be thought about next week. So I'm not going to spend any more time than that on that. But what we read in Psalm 48 is a recognition of the centrality of Jerusalem to the purpose of God. Great, says verse 1, is the Lord, and greatly to be praised in the city of our God, in the mountain of his holiness. Jerusalem is described as the city of God. It's there in verse 1, it's there again in verse 8 of Psalm 48. As we have heard, so have we seen, in the city of the Lord of hosts, in the city of our God. God will establish it forever. And what that tells us is there will always be a city of Jerusalem. There will be Jerusalem in the earth. And some of the things that we're going to think about this evening in terms of the history of Jerusalem, we're going to see the way in which God has preserved that and made sure that that is the case. But we want to start in June of 1967. This is where we got to at the end of our last talk. And in June of 1967, Israel has just gone through what is known as the Six-Day War, because it lasted for that amount of time. And as a result of that, you can see on the map on the left-hand side that Jerusalem, Israel, the state of Israel, occupied a vast area of what was known as Israel, what is known as Israel, or Palestine today, that it hadn't already occupied. In 1948, when the state of Israel was born, Israel didn't occupy all of the area that it would come to occupy in 1967. And you can see on the map the areas of the Golan Heights, the areas of the West Bank, which borders Jerusalem and sort of splits Jerusalem in half between east and west, and the area of Sinai. And all of that area came under Israeli control. And so the map on the right shows you the area of Jerusalem, split between West Jerusalem and East Jerusalem. And that whole city became part of the Jewish state, became part of the nation of Israel, and became under Jewish control. And that's where our story this evening really starts, with that picture that Jerusalem now sits administrated by the nation of Israel and the people of the Jews. Now, I want you to come with me, please, to the prophecy of Zechariah. Right at the very end of your Old Testaments. So the very last book of the Old Testament is the book of Malachi. The book of Zechariah comes just before that. And I want you to come and have a look at a prophecy in Zechariah. So Zechariah in chapter 12. Because this is going to set part of the foundation of how we see Jerusalem treated over the years from 1967 through to today. So we are told in verse 1, the burden of the word of the Lord for Israel, saith the Lord, which stretcheth forth the heavens and layeth the foundation of the earth and forms the spirit of man within him. God, it says, has created the world. Verse 2 tells us that God will make Jerusalem a cup of trembling unto all the people round about, when they shall be in the siege, both against Judah and against Jerusalem. I will make, says God, Jerusalem a burdensome stone. The history of Jerusalem is going to be a history of conflict and a history of turmoil until God steps in. And that's what we're going to see this evening. That once Israel gained control over all of Jerusalem, that caused the nations round about, particularly the Arab nations round about, to have even more of a grievance against the nation of Israel than they had already had up to this point. The war of 1967 was a war that was caused because the Arab peoples did not want to see a state of Israel. But once Israel took full control over the city of Jerusalem, that gave in many ways the Arab nations a focus on which to be able to build. That is a very mixed metaphor. But an absolute clarity of thought in terms of the state of Israel that said we can't let Israel continue. Israel, having taken possession of Jerusalem, became then the subject of the ire of the nations round about, even more than they already had. But actually, the city of Jerusalem was changed and molded by the Jewish state taking control over that sort of that blue area that you can see on the map, the area of municipal Jerusalem at the time of 1967. In his book on Jerusalem, called Jerusalem, a Biography, Simon Montefiore says, Israel officially united the city's two halves, expanded the municipal borders to encompass 196,000 Jews, 71,000 Arabs. The dilapidated Jewish quarter was restored, its dynamited synagogues rebuilt and re-sanctified, its ravaged squares and alleys repaved and embellished. Orthodox religious schools, known as yeshivas, were created or repaired, all in gleaming gold and stone. And the story of Jerusalem from this point is a story of the Jews sort of taking control of areas of Jerusalem that they then rebuilt and remodeled and repurposed for their own use. They made them Jewish religious areas in certain parts of Jerusalem. You can see the disparity between the number of Jews and the number of Arabs that were in the city of Jerusalem, the newly united city of Jerusalem in 1967. Come back from the prophecy of Zechariah with me to the prophecy of Joel. We want to look at two verses in the prophecy of Joel, Joel chapter 3. We're going to look at one now. We're going to look at one towards the end of our talk. So you will want to keep something in Joel chapter 3 for ease of access later on. We're interested in verse 1. It says verse 2 there. Please ignore that. It's verse 1 that we want to think about. Verse 1 says, "For behold, in those days and at that time, when I shall bring again the captivity of Judah and Jerusalem." So I have got the right quote on the screen, even though I got the wrong verse somehow. The captivity of Judah and Jerusalem. And in the last talk last week, we saw that God brought Israel back into the land of Israel to possess the land of Israel again in 1948. I mean, it had been happening as a process leading up to 1948, but in 1948, that process culminated with the creation of the state of Israel. And so when Joel speaks about God bringing back Judah, it is talking about 1948. That is the time, that is the year. But the captivity of Jerusalem continued because the nation of Israel didn't possess all of Jerusalem until 1967. And so Joel chapter 3 and verse 1 acts for us as the starting point of our thoughts this evening. That God has brought the captivity of Judah and the captivity of Jerusalem. And they have been returned, the nation of Israel, to that land that God spoke of. And by 1967, verse 1 of Joel chapter 3 was fulfilled. What God says will happen, will happen. When God speaks in the Bible, we can have absolute assurance that what he says is going to come to pass, will come to pass. Because we have the evidence of history to show us that when God says something, it will happen. I want you to come back now to Psalm 83. We want to look at Psalm 83 and verse 4. In verse 2, we are introduced to the enemies of God. Lo, thine enemies make a tumult, says Psalm 83 in verse 2. And in verse 4, they say, the enemies say, come and let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be no more in remembrance. The enemies of Israel want to cut that people off. And throughout the history from 1967 to today, we can draw a consistent line of enemies of Israel who have said just that. This is a quote from the president of Iraq on the 1st of June 1967, in the lead up to the Six-Day War. So the Six-Day War happened about a week later. It began about a week later in June. But on the 1st of June, Abdul Arif, the president of Iraq, said, the existence of Israel is an error which must be rectified. This is our opportunity to wipe out the disgrace which is Israel, which has been with us since 1948. Our goal is clear: to wipe Israel off the map. They have said, come and let us cut them off from being a nation. And in 1967, that is what they were saying, and that was the goal of the Six-Day War in 1967, to remove Israel. This that God says concerning his own enemies, is still the case, or was still the case in 1967. But we can bring that much more up to date. In 2005, the president of Iran, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, spoke to what was called the Islamic Student Association's conference entitled The World Without Zionism. On the 26th of October 2005, he wrote, or he said, our dear Imam said that the occupying regime, by which he means Israel, must be wiped off the map. And this was a very wise statement. We cannot compromise over the issue of Palestine. Is it possible to create a new front in the heart of an old front? That would be a defeat. Whoever accepts the legitimacy of this regime, the legitimacy of Israel, has in fact signed the defeat of the Islamic world. It has been the policy of Arab nations surrounding Israel to cause that nation to be removed. And Israel has lived in that state since its creation in 1948. That's what the president of Iraq said. And certainly since 1967, when instead of wiping Israel off the map, the Arab nations were forced to concede further territory to the nation of Israel. But now I want you to come to the prophecy of Ezekiel and chapter 38. Now, Ezekiel chapter 38 is speaking of a time that is in our future, and I'm not going to say very much about Ezekiel chapter 38 because it may well come up in next week's talk, God willing. But the one thing that I do want to point out is verse 8 of Ezekiel chapter 38, which says, after many days thou shalt be visited. In the latter years thou shalt come into the land that is brought back from the sword. And God is speaking to a particular enemy of Israel. And he is saying to that enemy that they are going to be brought into the land of Israel. The land that is brought back from the sword is the land of Israel, that is gathered out of many people, come against the mountains of Israel, which have been always waste. But it is brought forth out of the nations, and they shall dwell safely, all of them. And verse 11 says, thou shalt say, I will go up to the land of unwalled villages. I will go to them that are at rest. And so the Bible prophesies a future for the nation of Israel where it will be at peace. And that hasn't happened yet. This is a map of Israel's separation wall. It's around that area of Israel we saw on the map earlier of what is known as the West Bank. And it goes through the city of Jerusalem. So you can see marked out there, East Jerusalem, and then Bethlehem below that, and then Hebron slightly further down. South of Jerusalem, and it goes up to the top of that West Bank area up there. It is a massive wall carved through the state of Israel today. It was a wall that was built as a result of Palestinian attacks on Jerusalem and on other parts of Israel during what is known as the Second Intifada, and we're going to think about the Intifadas slightly later on. And it was built from the early 2000s and continued to be built for many, many years as section after section was added to this wall. And it is built with the purpose of keeping out attacks. In fact, there are statistics that show that as the wall was built, the number of attacks into Israel by the Palestinians dropped, and Israel uses that to point to the efficacy of the wall that they built, that it does have an effect. But it's a wall, and the Bible tells us that Israel will be a land of unwalled villages, and currently that is not the case. this is a section of the wall that runs through Jerusalem. This is a section of the wall that runs past Hebron that we saw on the map slightly further down. These are Arab olive pickers on the other side of the wall. Israel has built this wall for the purpose of keeping its enemies out. So one of the other threads that we are going to try and tell this evening is a glimpse at how it might be possible that Israel could be described as a land of unwalled villages. And so what we will see as we go through this evening, as we think about the history, not just of Jerusalem, but of Israel more generally, is Arab opposition to Israel that is slowly being molded into something that might be something else. June 1967 was the Six-Day War. On the 1st of September 1967, and in a week leading up to that date, the Arab League, which was a collection of Arab nations, met together in a place called Khartoum, and they made the Khartoum Resolution on the 1st of September 1967, paragraph 3 of which reads, "The Arab heads of state have agreed to unite their political efforts at the international and diplomatic level to eliminate the effects of the aggression and to ensure the withdrawal of the aggressive Israeli forces from the Arab lands which have been occupied since the aggression of the 5th of June. This will be done within the framework of the main principles by which the Arab states abide, namely," and these are what are known as the 3 no's of the Khartoum Resolution. No peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, no negotiations with Israel. Those are the 3 no's that formed the basis of Arab foreign policy towards Israel and their sort of other geopolitical partners at the time of 1967. There was an uncompromising stand against the nation of Israel by the Arab League. And that was unchangeable. It was set down as a resolution. It formed part of the guiding principles of the Arab nations that were signed up to this resolution, which was the Arab nations that surrounded Israel at the time. But there was something else. There was another possibility that was being mooted, another idea that was aimed at trying to bring peace in the Middle East. The UN Security Council made their own resolution on the 22nd of November 1967. And they resolved, this is UN Security Resolution 242, and this is going to be mentioned again later. But this resolution affirms that the fulfillment of Charter principles requires the establishment of a just and lasting peace in the Middle East, which should include the application of both the following principles: withdrawal of Israel armed forces, and it's interesting, it reads badly, but that is what the text says, withdrawal of Israel armed forces from territories occupied in the recent conflict. So this is talking about the Six-Day War. This was 5 months after the Six-Day War, a little bit more than that. And the termination of all claims or states of belligerency and respect for and acknowledgement of the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of every state in the area, and their right to live in peace within secure and recognized boundaries, free from threats or acts of force. And what this became known as, in terms of this resolution and the sort of political philosophy that this resolution sought to bring about throughout the world, was land for peace. the principle that Israel had gained all this land in 1967, and if it wanted peace, it would need to give some of it back. And that was the principle that was enshrined in this resolution. There's actually two. There was Security Resolution 242 and Security Resolution 338. And they both fundamentally say the same thing, that they come a couple of years apart. And that was the status quo. The Arab nations refused to have any dealings with Israel or to recognize that Israel existed. The UN pushed for Israel to be giving parts of its land back in order that there might broker some form of peace in this area. And there were years of massive international pressure on Israel. America weighed in and tried to force Israel to have negotiations with the Jordanians or with the Egyptians in terms of giving land back. And it's based on the land that was gained in 1967, and they all fell apart over the idea of a united Jerusalem. Once Israel had united the city of Jerusalem under its control, it would not move from that position. And so after a few years of international pressure, the president of Egypt, Anwar Sadat, launched a successful surprise attack on Israel from the 6th to the 25th of October, 1973. There was what is known in Israel as the Yom Kippur War, because the 6th of October was in Israel what is known as the Day of Atonement. In the Hebrew, it's Yom Kippur, a solemn feast for the Jews. And this war was launched on that day. And you can sort of compare the combatants at the time. So on the one hand, there was Israel. On the other hand, there were the Arab states led by Egypt and Syria, but joined by Cuba, because actually this was part of a bigger political thing in terms of the Cold War. And the disparity in troop numbers and preparation was massive. I'm not going to read over the numbers. You can go over them yourselves. But what was surprising was that Israel had been warned about this. So on the night of the 25th of September, the King of Jordan, King Hussein, flew to Tel Aviv, and he warned the Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir that there was going to be an impending Syrian attack that eventually came to pass 2 weeks later. And Golda Meir didn't believe him. She said, are they going to go to war without the Egyptians? The King of Jordan said he didn't think so. He says, I think Egypt will cooperate with them. Golda Meir says, that's not going to happen. They did not believe that Egypt in particular were going to move against them in the south, in that area of the Sinai Peninsula. In fact, it's believed, and it's hard to put them all together, but that throughout that month of September leading up to the 6th of October, Israel had received at least 11 warnings that this was coming and this was going to happen. And yet, the Israeli intelligence agency continued to insist that war wasn't a possibility, that it wasn't going to come. They trusted in themselves. And at that time, the Arabs came, the Arab states, and joined with Cuba, and they attacked Israel. And there were successes. So Egypt was able to move up into the Sinai Peninsula. Syria was able to come down into that area that we saw on the map previously, known as the Golan Heights. And they were able to take possession of part of those lands. And it was only with an airlift of supplies that was provided by the Americans to Israel that enabled Israel then to push back and to retain the same borders as had been won in 1967. So in the end, finally, when it came to the 25th of October, there was no real difference in the boundaries that had been established then. The Arabs call it the October Arab-Israeli War of 1973. On October the 6th, Egypt and Syria jointly launched a surprise attack against Israel in order to regain the territory they lost in 1967. And you can sort of follow through and see the way that Egypt came up into Sinai, Syria came down into the Golan Heights. Egypt took part of the area, Syria took part of the Golan Heights, but on October the 14th, the US launched a massive airlift of military supplies to Israel, which helped to bolster its defenses. On October the 17th, OPEC, so the oil and petroleum conglomerate, imposed an embargo on the United States and other nations for supplying weapons to Israel. The embargo lasted until March of 1974 and caused sort of gas prices to rocket in America and across the world. On October the 22nd, we mentioned Resolution 338 already, which called for an immediate ceasefire and negotiations that would end the conflict. That didn't happen. Israel wouldn't be stopped at that point until October the 25th, when a second ceasefire was secured. The war was ended, and in the end, the borders remained the same. Israel retained control over Sinai and the area of the Golan Heights. It was overwhelming odds against the nation of Israel. And one of the things that we can be assured of in this is that God has not cast away his people. One of the cries of churches today, Christian churches today, is that God has rejected Israel and Israel have been replaced by the church. And so the people of God who were the Jews in the past are now the church. But the evidence of history, the evidence of events such as this, events where Israel should have been wiped off the map, where the United States had very little to gain from supplying Israel and quite a lot to lose in terms of its economic position because of the oil embargo that was placed against it by OPEC. And yet Israel was able to overcome those odds. America still went to the aid of Israel. God has not cast away his people. We aren't going to go and have a look at Romans chapter 11, but if you were to take some time to read through Romans chapter 11, you would see the way that God describes the position of the nation of Israel, that they are still his people, that the hope of the Bible is the hope of Israel, that the city of Jerusalem is the city of God and will be established forever. So we mentioned Land for Peace previously. In 1979, March 26, 1979, these three men signed what became known as the Camp David Accords because talks had taken place over the previous month or so at, well, actually, that's not true. Talks had taken place in 1975. The signing only happened in March 78. The signing only happened in March 79. Talks had taken place at the presidential retreat known as Camp David. And Article 2 of the Camp David Accords says the permanent boundary between Egypt and Israel is the recognized international boundary between Egypt and the former mandated territory of Palestine. So that is basically saying that the borders of 1948, before Israel had taken control over that area of the peninsula of Sinai to its south that bordered onto Egypt. So those borders before that expansion would be the boundary between Israel and Egypt. So land for peace, that was what happened. In March of 1979, Israel signed over control of the that area of Sinai, where it bordered with Egypt, and gave that back to the Egyptian state at that time. The article finishes, each will respect the territorial integrity of the other, including their territorial waters and airspace. There was to be no more conflict written into these accords. Israel had sold off its land to buy peace with Egypt. That is, the three men there on the left-hand side, it's the Egyptian President Anwar Sadat. In the middle is the American President, Jimmy Carter. And on the right-hand side is the Israeli Prime Minister, Menachem Begin. There they are, looking cheerful with each other, having signed those accords. This is the map. This is not the map because this has stopped moving on. You can't see the map. One day you might be able to see the map, but who knows if you'll be able to see the map. Why aren't you doing anything now? There you are. Look at that. This is the map that comes with the accords. It's terrible, but there's Egypt, there's Israel, there's the border that comes. So this is the Sinai Peninsula that Israel had control over in October of 1967, June of 1967, that was given back March of 1979. And Egypt then were given control over that area. Israel sold that land for peace. But this brought into question the status of Jerusalem. Because if Israel were prepared to sell that land to Egypt in order to buy peace, well, what about that portion of Jerusalem that they had acquired in the Six-Day War in 1967? Well, in 1980, to set the scene, Israel has a set of 14 basic laws. Israel don't have a written constitution, but these basic laws are the fundamental principles upon which the Supreme Court in Israel makes decisions about the laws of the land. Can you do something? Well, does it contravene one of these 14 basic laws? No, it doesn't. Is there any other reason why you can't do it? No, there isn't. Then you can do it. But these 14 basic laws have been set down since 1948 and have been added to. So there was one basic law in 1948, and they have been added to until there are currently 14 of them. They cover a range of laws and principles. They cover principles of human rights and things like that. Law 7 was passed on the 30th of July, 1980. So Israel sold off the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt in order to gain peace in 1979. That caused a series of questions. What are we going to do with Jerusalem? What do we do with the other areas that were gained in 1967? And that led to this basic law being written into the Israeli sort of legal system. And the basic law says that Jerusalem, complete and united, is the capital of Israel. And in terms of Israeli law, the Supreme Court then ruled that what this basic law meant was that in 1967, Israel took control over Eastern Jerusalem, and Eastern Jerusalem then was annexed and became part of the Israeli state. and became under the supreme authority of Israel. Jerusalem, complete and united, is the capital of Israel. They passed that law, like I said, 30th of July, 1980. Jerusalem is a burdensome stone, says God in Zechariah, you will remember. And so in 1980, the UN Security Council recalled its resolution 476. It reaffirmed that the acquisition of territory by force was inadmissible. It says, we are deeply concerned over the enactment of a basic law in the Israeli Knesset proclaiming a change in the character and status of the holy city of Jerusalem with its implications for peace and security. It censures in the strongest terms the enactment by Israel of the basic law on Jerusalem and the refusal to comply with relevant Security Council resolutions. So because of this basic law, Israel was seen to be in violation of the Security Council resolutions, such as the resolutions that we'd already seen, 242, 338, that both said you can't acquire territory through war. And Israel saying that Jerusalem was the united capital of Israel, East and West Jerusalem joined together under one jurisdiction and under one authority, brought this international response by the UN Security Council. That then emboldened various Arab and particularly Palestinian terrorist groups. And so on the 9th of December 1987, the first Intifada was declared. The word Intifada is an Arab word which means an uprising. And it's a Palestinian revolt that began in Gaza that spread across to Jerusalem. You can see along the bottom sort of the timeline of the various intifadas. There are two of them that have happened from 1987, the end of 1987 into 1988. That lasted until 1994. And then the second intifada began in 2000, at the end of 2000, and lasted until 2005. And what brought it to an end, and this is sort of jumping ahead a bit in the story, and we'll get back to this in a moment, but what brought it to an end was the disengagement of Israel from the Gaza Strip. This intifada is known by a number of different things. The Arabs call it the Stone Intifada because hordes of Arab terrorists with rocks would be hurling rocks at Jewish police and the Jewish military. There were battles that took place on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem at the time. And one of the things you can see that the Intifada came to the end in 93, the end of 1993. One of the things that came about as a result of this was what are known as the Oslo Accords. So you've got Bill Clinton there, the American president, in the middle. You've got Yitzhak Rabin, the Israeli prime minister, on the left-hand side. You've got Yasser Arafat, the head of the Palestinian Authority, on the right-hand side. And among the notable outcomes of the Oslo Accords was the creation of the Palestinian National Authority, which was tasked with the responsibility of conducting limited Palestinian self-governance over parts of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. So at this time, Israel allowed the creation of a government body, to put it in those terms, that had some control over certain areas of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. It was incredibly limited. The Palestinians and certain Palestinian sort of writers called it the Palestinian Versailles. They found the Oslo Accords incredibly humiliating because they were so limited in the sort of extent to which the Palestinians gained governance and self-governance over these fairly small pockets of Israel. What it also did, though, was bring international acknowledgement of the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, as Israel's partner in permanent status negotiations. And so from this time on, Israel had someone that they could negotiate a permanent sort of recognition with in terms of the Palestinian state. Previously, Palestinians had been led by sort of various terrorist organizations. There was the Muslim Brotherhood that became Hamas in 1985, I think it was. And sort of up to this point, there hadn't been a single recognized, internationally recognized authority that Israel were expected to negotiate with. The Oslo Accords brought that about. And that then led on the 15th of August 2005 to Israel withdrawing from all settlements in the Gaza Strip. So you can see on the right-hand side a map of the Gaza Strip. Down there in the south of the Gaza Strip, you can see sort of various areas that were Israeli settlements. This was a map from May 2005. In August of 2005, those settlements were forcibly removed. If the settlers hadn't left those areas, Jewish authorities came and forcibly took them away. And they had barricaded themselves in, and they were removed by the Israeli authorities to allow for the disengagement of Israel, which had been proposed in 2003, which was enacted in 2005. The settlers who refused to accept government compensation packages and voluntarily vacate their homes prior to the August the 15th deadline were evicted by Israeli security forces over a period of several days. And the Palestinian Authority was then given the opportunity to hold elections. And they did. In January 2006, there were elections that were held. Hamas won in Gaza, and Fatah, who were another Palestinian political party, won in the West Bank. This led to a period of stalemate and a period where nobody really knew quite what they were going to do. And in March 2007, the Palestinian Legislative Council approved the formation of a national unity government with an 83-3 vote. And the reason why they did this was that Fatah was a recognized political party, whereas Hamas were a terrorist organization. And they had won the vote in Gaza and the Gaza Strip. But there was reluctance to allow them to have governance over the Gaza Strip. And so this 83-3 vote by the Palestinian Legislative Council approved the formation of a national unity government, which would supersede the result of the elections in January 2006. Government ministers were sworn in, and there were ceremonies that were held at Gaza and Ramallah over in the West Bank. But in June of that year, so from March to June, 3 months went by. And in June of that year, Hamas militarily took control of the Gaza Strip. They forced out Fatah, and Hamas became the ruling authority. A terrorist organization ruled over that area of Gaza. Hamas was formed in 1985, but its charter was written in August of 1988. There is an article in The Atlantic by an academic called Bruce Hoffman, written on October the 10th, 2023. The article is called "Understanding Hamas's Genocidal Ideology. A close read of Hamas's founding documents clearly shows their intentions." And he sort of breaks down the founding charter of Hamas and says the most relevant of the document's 36 articles could be summarized as falling within 4 main themes: the complete destruction of Israel as an essential condition for the liberation of Palestine and the establishment of a theocratic state based on Islamic law. The need for both unrestrained and unceasing jihad to attain the above objective. It's what we saw with the Iraqi president in 1967 and the Iranian president in 2005. It's the same thought, that Israel must be destroyed. The enemies of Israel want them cast out of the land, just as Psalm 83 says that they will. This charter was reformed in 2017. It was edited slightly, but the basic tenets of the charter remained the same. Whilst this was happening, the idea of land for peace had, in many ways, come to its culmination. Israel had given back the Sinai. Israel had given back control over the Gaza Strip and the West Bank to the Palestinians. The land had been given away. The peace didn't come, though, and Israel still remained threatened by organizations like Hamas, who believed that they should be removed, by the Iranian president in 2005, as we saw, who believed that it was part of Iran's mission to remove Israel from the map. But things moved on. In 2020, on September the 15th, there was a set of normalization treaties that were signed between Israel, Bahrain, and the UAE. They were known as the Abraham Accords. There was also Morocco, who became part of the Abraham Accords as well. And other Arab nations were encouraged to be part of these accords. You can see on the screen the Bahraini foreign minister, the Israeli prime minister, Netanyahu, second on the left there, Donald Trump, the American president, and the Emirati foreign minister, all there, having signed these Abraham Accords. And that began a process of Arab nations seeking to normalize relations between themselves and Israel. In 1967, the Khartoum Resolution, the three no's were finally being moved out of the way. And these Arab nations began the process of negotiation and normalization of international relations between themselves and Israel. And that was followed up with the possibility of a Saudi Arabian Israeli normalization agreement. It was called the deal of the century by the Egyptian general turned President Abdel al-Sisi, who said that the formation of a normalization treaty between Saudis and Israel would be the deal of the century. It would formalize relations between enough Arab nations and Israel to make the momentum almost unstoppable at that point. It would cause Saudi Arabia to become probably the most powerful Arabian nation. It would give Saudi Arabia an absolute control over a number of the nations in the area with this agreement that would be made with Israel. And yet there hasn't been a deal between Saudi Arabia and Israel done. We can see the movement towards peace that Ezekiel chapter 38 tells us will be the state at the time when Ezekiel chapter 38 is speaking of. But it hasn't come yet. And in fact, the possibility of this agreement between the Saudis and Israel seems to be the cause, or at least one of the motivating factors, for what we are currently seeing in Israel today. On the 7th of October, Hamas launched an estimated 2,200 rockets into southern Israel as it continued to work towards the fulfillment of its charter to remove Israel from the map. This is the position we are in now. This is the state that Israel and Jerusalem find themselves in, under attack from this terrorist organization who has control over the area. This is the response that Israel is making at the moment as they go into Gaza, as they seize these military posts to try and remove this threat. I want you to come back to the prophecy of Joel in chapter 3, and we'll finish here. This is as present in terms of the state of Jerusalem as we're going to get this evening, the war that is still going on over the existence of Israel and the possession of Israel of Jerusalem. And in Joel chapter 3, God has set out for us the hostility that there will be between the nation of Israel and the area that includes the area of the Gaza Strip. So in Joel chapter 3, we read verse 1, didn't we, which brought us up to 1967. Now read verse 4. Yea, says God, what have ye to do with me, O Tyre and Zidon, and all the coasts of Palestine? Will ye render me a recompense? And if ye recompense me, if you come against me, says God, swiftly and speedily will I return your recompense upon your own head. And we are going to investigate next week the way in which God will do that. And we will see the way that God will bring peace in this area, which hasn't seen peace, and will bring that peace forever.